4 young men, a casting call, a television network, and a decision that would accidentally create one of the most complicated stories in pop music history. At 81, Micky Dolenz, the last surviving face of the Monkees, has turned down a reunion tour. And the reason why tells you everything about what this band actually was. To understand it, you have to go back to Los Angeles in 1965, where NBC and producer Bert Schneider were building something that had never really been done before. They weren't looking for a band. They were casting one. Out of hundreds of hopefuls, 4 young men were chosen: Micky Dolenz, Davy Jones, Michael Nesmith, and Peter Tork. Not because they played together. Because together, they looked like they could. But here's where it gets interesting. The moment the cameras rolled, something unexpected happened. The fiction started becoming real. The show hit NBC on September 12, 1966, and within weeks, the fake band had real chart toppers. Last Train to Clarksville went to number 1. Then came I'm a Believer, written by Neil Diamond, also number 1, one of the best-selling singles of 1967. The machine was working perfectly. Almost too perfectly. Because behind all that success was a secret the band members themselves were only just beginning to understand. The music wasn't theirs. The songs were written by hired songwriters. The instruments were played by elite Los Angeles session musicians called the Wrecking Crew. A man named Don Kirshner controlled everything: the recordings, the releases, the catalog. The Monkees were the faces on a finished product they had no hand in making. And for Michael Nesmith, who was already a songwriter before any of this began, that was not something he was willing to accept quietly. Nesmith pushed back hard. Peter Tork, who came from the Greenwich Village folk scene and could play multiple instruments, backed him up. Even Davy Jones resisted being treated as a decoration. Then, in February 1967, Kirshner went too far. He released A Little Bit Me, A Little Bit You without telling any of them. And that was the moment everything exploded. Nesmith confronted Kirshner directly in a Los Angeles meeting, threatened to walk, and forced the dispute all the way up to NBC, Screen Gems, and the record label. What happened next was almost unheard of in 60s pop music. The manufactured Act 1. Kirshner was removed. The band took control. And what they did with that control stunned everyone. The album they made was called Headquarters, released May 22, 1967. Nearly every instrument, played by the 4 of them. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200. Sold over 2 million copies in the United States. A band that critics had dismissed as a Beatles imitation had just proved they could stand on their own. But the victory came with a catch nobody had anticipated. The moment the external structure disappeared, the cracks inside the band became visible. Nesmith was a seasoned guitarist and writer. Tork was musically versatile. But Dolenz was still developing as a drummer, learning parts under tight deadlines. Jones, charismatic and vocally gifted, was less involved with instruments. The creative freedom they'd fought for was real, but so was the exhaustion of sustaining it. By the time they were recording the next album, session musicians were quietly brought back in. Not because they'd failed. Because the reality of independence was harder than the idea of it. By late 1967, the band that had successfully rebelled against its own creators was now struggling to agree on what it actually wanted to be. The structure that had made them move fast was gone, and what replaced it was 4 individuals with 4 different visions. That tension never fully resolved. And things were about to get much worse. When the Monkees' original run ended in the early 70s, the 4 members didn't land in the same place. Nesmith pivoted into country rock. Dolenz moved into acting and television work. But for Peter Tork, the exit from the band was the beginning of a long, slow unraveling. He formed a group called Release. It went nowhere. He taught guitar, worked odd jobs, and tried repeatedly to build something new. Nothing held. In 1972, he was arrested for drug possession, serving a short prison sentence. For someone who had been one of the most recognized faces on American television just a few years earlier, it was a stark and painful fall. But by the end of the decade, Tork had begun pulling himself back. Slowly. And then, something none of them expected, the world came looking for them again. MTV launched in 1981, and with it came reruns of the Monkees TV series, now beaming into living rooms of teenagers who weren't even born during the original run. The response was immediate. Merchandise flew off shelves. Soundtrack reissues sold. And industry executives saw exactly what they were looking at, a nostalgia goldmine ready to be reopened. By 1986, a reunion tour was on. Dolenz, Talk, and Jones took the stage. Nesmith declined, focused on his own career. And the shows were a genuine commercial success, nearly 20 years after the band's television debut. But success on the outside didn't mean peace on the inside. The old fights came back in new forms. Instead of arguing about who controlled the recording sessions, they were now arguing about set lists. Promoters wanted the hits, I'm a Believer, Daydream Believer, Last Train to Clarksville, songs guaranteed to get the crowd singing in the first 8 bars. But some members wanted room for deeper cuts, storytelling, context. The tension between nostalgia product and honest history had returned, and this time there was no Don Kirshner to blame it on. As the touring years stretched into the 90s and 2000s, lineups shifted constantly. Talk joined and dropped out in cycles. Financial disputes over revenue splits and management decisions became recurring flashpoints. Davy Jones died in 2012. Talk followed in 2019. Nesmith in 2021. One by one, the band shrank until only Dolenz remained. And that's when the question changed entirely. It was no longer about reunion. It was about something harder. What do you do with a legacy that has outgrown the people who built it? Dolenz, now the last consistent voice in the story, had been quietly arriving at an answer for years. He had never stopped performing, but he had stopped thinking of the shows as reunions of a working band. Instead, he treated them as something closer to living history, performances where songs were not just played but explained, where he would tell audiences how the records were actually made, who played what in those 1966 sessions, how the revolt against Kirshner shaped headquarters, what it felt like to be a television character who became real. The music and the story were inseparable. You couldn't honestly deliver one without the other. The problem was that the commercial touring industry had no interest in that version of the show. The nostalgia circuit runs on scale and predictability. Promoters need repeatable performances, tight schedules, and set lists that trigger recognition within seconds. A concert that stops to explain history, acknowledge grief, and sit with complexity disrupts the whole engine. It slows the pacing. It reduces uniformity across cities. It's not what the ticket-buying model is built for. So when later reunion proposals arrived, they came with a condition Dolenz wouldn't meet: strip the story down to the hits, keep it moving, make it simple. And he said no. Not because he didn't want to perform. Not because he was bitter or exhausted. But because he refused to let 60 years of complicated, fractured, genuinely remarkable history be flattened into a greatest hits replay. The Monkees were born as a television illusion. They fought their way into something real. They fell apart, came back, lost their members one by one. And through all of it, Micky Dolenz was there, watching, performing, remembering. At 81, he knows what that story is worth. And he's decided it's worth more than a nostalgia package. You can argue with the decision, but it's hard to argue with the reason.